Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. Chinese authorities announced on Thursday plans to bypass Hong Kong's legislature to enact a national security law that pro-democracy campaigners say is aimed at cracking down on dissent in the city. A motion to enable the drafting of the law, which targets secession, sedition, terrorism and foreign interference in Hong Kong, was brought before the National People's Congress, China's lawmaking body, at its annual meeting in Beijing on Friday. The introduction of the legislation has sparked fear and outrage from pro-democracy figures in Hong Kong who say that Beijing has fallen back on promises it made when it took back the former British colony in 1997. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the national security law for Hong Kong. Joining me on the program today are Ashok Sajjanhar, former ambassador, Pramit Chaudhari, Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, and Srikanth Kondapalli, Professor, Chinese Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Professor, let me begin the program with you first. Let's try and understand and analyze what the national security law is all about.
Well, they have not yet clearly mentioned what are the provisions of this, but it looks like the National People's Congress is still deliberating. There is a committee that was formed to look at these issues. But what we have come to know about this is, as you mentioned, the sedition, external interference, separatism, and one set of issues. Second is how to implement China's laws and legal and other mechanisms implementation in Hong Kong. Now, the last part of that is they plan to establish intelligence agencies as well as police units, specialized police units in Hong Kong so that they can curb the protests. Now, the problem for Hong Kong is this violates the Article 22 of the Basic Law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Article 22 suggests that no central government agency can interfere in Hong Kong's functioning. Under the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, they have promised that for 50 years, since 1997 takeover of Hong Kong, they will not use any of the mainland provisions in Hong Kong. So this basically violates the autonomy that under the two systems that Hong Kong has been enjoying since 1997, number one. Number two, Article 12 of the Basic Law also suggests that there will be a high degree of autonomy. With the National People's Congress jettisoning some of the laws of Hong Kong, so this violates basically the Article 12 of the Basic Law. So this is another major problem for. Then there is also Article 23. In 2003, Hong Kong tried to remove some of the provisions of these in terms of curtailing freedoms, speech, assembly, and so on and so forth. And in 2003, nearly 500,000 people demonstrated against this, and that was finally jettisoned. Now, you know that since last year, early last year, there has been a move to introduce an extradition bill that also faced huge protests. Almost 3 to 4 million out of 7.5 million people participated sporadically, spontaneously in what was mentioned as flow with the water campaign. And that led to a substantial outcry, and the extradition bill has been cancelled. So this is the context for the National People's Congress to introduce the bill to curtail the freedoms in Hong Kong.
Okay, all right. Talking about curtailing the freedoms in Hong Kong, Ambassador, the international community seems to be a little worried about all of this. You know, there are several media reports that spoke about how, if this goes through, then the US might impose sanctions. There are other countries in Europe as well who are extremely concerned. Why is the international community worried about it?
I think basically, Frank, because what China is trying to do is, of course, in terms of hugely curtailing the autonomy of the residents of Hong Kong in terms of all the freedoms that have been made available to them as a result of the mini constitution or the basic law, in terms of assembly, in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of freedom of expression, even as far as the independent judiciary is concerned. All these rights are likely to be taken away from them. And also, as was being mentioned, the national security agencies, their offices will also be established. So basically, anyone who is found to be protesting or who's found to be criticizing the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, they could be booked under this particular law. So basically, I think what the world thinks is that this is a death knell as far as the basic law of Hong Kong is concerned. It is completely removing the autonomy that has been given. And what is also very serious and very disconcerting is that although China has been trying to get this law, national security law, passed in Hong Kong through the Hong Kong legislature, ever since 1997, when this Hong Kong came under its own jurisdiction, but it has not been able to do thus far. And now what it has done is it has completely sidestepped the Hong Kong legislature and decided to impose this on Hong Kong. So they have had no discussion, they have had no deliberations on this. It has been imposed upon them. So Hong Kong, as it is known now, it will be the end of one country, two systems, because Hong Kong will then come completely under the Chinese system, because in China, there is no freedom of speech, there is no freedom of expression, there is no freedom of assembly. And all these laws, all these rights are likely to be taken away from Hong Kong as a result of this. And that is why, and the fact that this is happening at this moment, when obviously China feels that it is strong enough to sort of cock a snook at the world, when the whole world is dealing with the coronavirus. And it would have thought that even in Hong Kong, people are, given out to social distancing and all the other restrictions and constraints, they would not come out. But I think Hong Kong, like last year, more than 2 million people came out at one juncture out together. I think this time also on Sunday, yesterday, Hong Kong residents have surprised many people, many watchers of the situation. And they found in several thousands, they came out and defying both the law as well as social distancing. So I think the world is rightly concerned and worried, and 200 of these political leaders around the world, they have written a missive to China appealing that this should be taken back.
Absolutely. All right. So, Pramit, since we are here, what does all of this mean for the people of Hong Kong, really? Because they have been protesting now for several years. You've seen several of the youth of Hong Kong come out onto the streets and, make a point. So what does all of this mean for them?
Well, over the past several years, and I think some of the other speakers have mentioned this, you've seen the mainland Chinese government slowly restrict the autonomy and freedoms of Hong Kong, of Hong Kongers themselves. The assumption early on was that, except for a very small group of pro-democracy activists, most people in Hong Kong were basically apolitical and didn't care as long as the colony's prosperity, overall prosperity, continued. And now we've seen, I would argue, a confluence of two things. One is that the prosperity of Hong Kong is one of the most unequal societies in the world in terms of its Gini coefficient. While they're obviously in downtown Hong Kong, it's very wealthy and it's very well off and it's very nicely organized. Most Hong Kongers live, 4 or 5 people to a room in Kowloon and other places, and it's really tight. And I forgot the Gini coefficient, but I think it's well over 40, 42, 43. In comparison, for example, India is about 32, 33. So therefore, that was always an issue. That was going to be a social problem, and a number of people had written about this earlier, that there was the possibility of a social powder keg in Hong Kong over this inequality. And then on top of that, as we mentioned, is the increasingly more flagrant violations of Hong Kong freedoms and attempts to actually legislate these by Beijing, with first, as I mentioned, with the extradition law, and now with this national security law, the mainland China is no longer even pretending to try to work through the structures of Hong Kong's own government, which they also control. They're just now saying, in this case, the national, Beijing will pass the law, and then Hong Kong will just replicate it without any real question, as mentioned, of any real consultation and so on. So I think we're now at this point, and this is combined with that existing social problem. I think for people of Hong Kong, they don't really have too many options. Nobody's obviously prepared to intervene in Hong Kong on behalf of them against China. China is simply too powerful. Hong Kong is accepted by most countries as being, even if it's a second, as I said, two systems, it's still one China. And the only real weapon that exists, and I don't think the Chinese care about global public opinion, that's been very clear, I think, during the entire pandemic. They've sort of given up on trying to rule hearts and minds, except in a few select areas of the world. So I think what we're going to see now, the only real question is whether U.S. sanctions would keep China from moving too rapidly. The U.S. sanctions are not normal sanctions. America grants Hong Kong a special status in terms of trade, investment, and finance. So, for example, there are almost zero tariffs between Hong Kong and the United States. And U.S. companies operate in Hong Kong more or less like they would do so in Britain or any other place, especially financial companies. There's about roughly $100 billion worth of investment by the Americans in Hong Kong, and roughly a similar amount of trade. But it is pegged on a U.S. law that says that every year the U.S. government must tell the U.S. Congress and certify that the special status can be continued on the basis of the certification that Washington believes that there is sufficient autonomy in Hong Kong for this to be worth giving. In other words, it gets a special status because it has a certain degree of independence from China, and this has to be certified every year by the U.S. government. If the day that is withdrawn, then Hong Kong is treated just like normal mainland China. And we would assume a lot of American companies use Hong Kong as their gateway to mainland China. They would either move out of Hong Kong, go to Singapore or somewhere else, or at least reduce, or say that why do we have to be in Hong Kong? Then we might as well go to Shanghai and work. But this would massively diminish Hong Kong. It's basically a financial city. Diminish Hong Kong's, should we say, economy, aggravated situation. But that's something that the Chinese government maybe, and this is going to be interesting to watch. Do they believe, one, that America with presidential elections coming up and a dysfunctional president really would not have the guts to go ahead with this, or the bandwidth to go ahead with to attacking Hong Kong? Or two, will China just say we can absorb the $100 billion loss and we don't mind Hong Kong economy taking a fall, and we can just absorb this damage in return for essentially eradicating Hong Kong's autonomy?
Right. Okay. All right. So, Professor, since we're here and since we are talking about the people of Hong Kong, of course, there are external factors as elaborated there by Pramit. But, what about the internal factors? He spoke about it initially in his opening remarks. What options do the people of Hong Kong have really other than going to the streets?
Well, I think the Hong Kong people have asked for the full implementation of universal suffrage. That could have possibly addressed many of these issues, because Hong Kong people would have then participated in the decision-making process. And that could have translated in terms of their grievances being channelized, and some solutions could be found. However, in 2017, the chief executive officer, who is not really bound by the legislative council's advice and so on, under the constitutional provisions, Hong Kong strictly does not have the separation of powers that we see in India, for instance, between judiciary, executive, legislature. That kind of separation of powers do not exist in a objective manner. So as a result, the 2017 Chief Executive Officer under the Basic Law in 1997, in 1990 when it was enacted, and then Hong Kong when it reverted back to China, the Basic Law suggested that by 2017, the Chief Executive Officer will be elected by the Hong Kong people themselves. As of now, they have representation, half representation. Out of nearly 70 seats in the LegCo, half were by the universal suffrage, half by certain constituencies like business groups, like academics, like media, like various functional constituencies. Now, the Basic Law suggested that there will be a universal suffrage by 2017 when the Chief Executive Officer will be directly elected by the people of Hong Kong. However, the Politburo of the Communist Party of China suggested that the candidature of the CEOs of Hong Kong should be vetted by the Politburo itself. Their CVs will be considered first, and then they will select who will be the final candidate for the Chief Executive Officer position. Now, that has led to, again, protests because Hong Kong people do not see that they will be effectively influencing the decision-making process through the elections. So this is one which also got stuck in this catch-22 position in terms of the democracy and so on. Second, they were trying to suggest that, as Pramit mentioned, there is the inequality. Many Hong Kongers could not really afford to buy an apartment because of the high concentration, and also because there is a lot of ill-gotten money from mainland China. Hong Kong law does not ask for where you got your money from. So many corrupt officials in China, they come and buy up the real estate in Hong Kong. So that resulted in huge real estate crisis in terms of skyrocketing of the prices. So for the ordinary Hong Kong people, this is really problematic. So this is a basically existential question for them that needs to be addressed.
Okay, all right. Ambassador, broadening the scope of the discussion now, is this a pattern really as far as China is concerned? You had Ladakh, Sikkim, Nepal as well, the Mount Everest issue, then Taiwan, and now Hong Kong.
No, I think so, because if you look at it as to why has the China been flexing its muscles, as I very briefly referred to, I think at this moment it finds, number one, that, and it announced also at the National People's Congress, that China has been able to defeat the coronavirus. So it is out of it. Its economy is working, while all the other countries, particularly the major countries, United States, Europe, Japan, etc., they are still dealing with the virus, and it's going to be some time that their economies start coming up. So it finds that it itself is in a very good situation, so to say, to take on the world. And I think that is what it is trying to do. It is flexing its muscles. Of course, I would imagine that as far as India is concerned, whether it is Sikkim, whether it is Ladakh, or even as far as Nepal is concerned, Nepal might have done either sort of, to curry favor with China, to the sort of language that was used by Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli when he was talking about the virus and all coming from India, or as far as the other problems on Kalapani and Lipulekh, etc. are concerned, basically to curry favor and to present himself in a good light. I think as far as India is concerned, what China is trying to do is to pressurize India so that it doesn't go too far towards, let us say, the positions that are being taken on independent, comprehensive scientific investigation, etc., on the virus, as far as the positions of the West are concerned. And India also occupies the position of the chairman of the executive board of the World Health Assembly. So I think this is basically telling India that you have these many pressure points, we have these cards in our hands. I think as far as South China Sea is concerned and Hong Kong is concerned, I think Hong Kong is maybe in that sense somewhat different because both in terms of the domestic problems that the Chinese Communist Party is facing, Xi Jinping himself is facing in terms of the economic problems, in terms of the criticism that he himself personally has been receiving in as to how China dealt with the coronavirus pandemic when it started in the initial 2 months or so. So I think basically trying to get over that, China is reaching out and saying that, our core interests will not be compromised and we are strong enough. I would recall that Xi Jinping also, when he was returning from Mamallapuram last October, and he had stopped over in Nepal and he had said that those who want to split China, their bodies will be smashed and their bones will be crushed to powder or something. I've never really heard any head of state or government using language of this nature. But I think the idea is the message that is being sent out is that it is a strong party, it's a strong leader which is fully capable of taking care of the interest. But one last point here, Frank, I would like to mention is that it is being done as far as Hong Kong is concerned, but I think it is also not a very subtle message to Taiwan, that China is very much determined and willing and able to take care of its interests and of not allow any of the territory to go away. So they should not start having these ideas that independence is a possibility.
Absolutely. Pramit, since we are here, as far as timing is concerned and as far as the pattern is concerned, let me also take a point that the ambassador is making forward. Is it also, an attempt by Xi Jinping or mainland China to deflect from the kind of backlash that he has received, or the kind of the anger that has been seen in mainland China?
Well, these are hard. We can only fear and speculate because China is such a black box. However, there has been evidence of dissent in China. Posts that have come on WeChat and on the internet attacking unusually, I wouldn't say large numbers, but the occasional attack on the Chinese internet, most of which are taken down obviously very quickly. There's some occasional rumors of some unrest or dissent within the party, unhappiness about how he's handled the pandemic, even concerns that he is becoming he's taking on, driving China towards an open conflict with the United States at a time when China is not really ready for this, and so on. We don't know if that's enough to trouble him. He is still immensely powerful. And we can then only speculate, because I said the system is extraordinarily closed, and it is now even more closed than it was before, because there has been a huge crackdown on dissent even before the pandemic. So therefore, it's really hard to tell. Second, however, definitely their international image has taken a huge beating. China was trying very hard to position itself as sort of that at a time when America, especially under Trump, was seen, for example, by Europeans as almost as bad as China, if not worse. China tried to position itself as the country, the superpower in the making that could provide for international trade, help on climate, be the new reasonable partner for Germany and so on. Now we've seen, especially during this pandemic, China's almost given up on pretending that it can win hearts and minds. It's been abusive almost in its attacks on the European governments in particular. It's an open battle, for example, with Sweden, Australia, the Czech Republic, countries that really didn't. Australia was sort of sitting on the fence regarding China, and now they've really come out hitting hard, partly because China's hit them hard. The ambassador mentioned about the sort of language being used by Chinese diplomats. Chinese ambassadors now are among the most abusive people. Normally, countries, including China, have tended to use their diplomats as the good cop in their messaging, and let others decide, so on. And then finally, we've seen China being extremely assertive in the South China Sea again, sinking the Vietnamese ship. Its language on Taiwan has shifted interestingly. It has dropped. They recently dropped the use of the term peaceful unification of Taiwan. The word peaceful has now been dropped. It has just said we will go for unification. There may be some relationship with the problems we face on the border. I'm not clear on that. Those could actually be just local. But there's just general sense, I think, in China that we are better off being feared than loved, because the pandemic, in effect, has lost us the chance of being liked. And they've been remarkably ungenerous. At the G20 virtual summit that was called in Prime Minister Modi's initiative, all of the G20 countries promised that they would waive debt to the least developed countries. China agreed there, and then right after that came out and said, however, debt under the Belt Road Initiative would not be covered by the G20 promise, which meant almost all debt. In other words, they were basically saying, we're not writing off anybody's debt. You still have to pay us, or you have to give us assets, and our control, our economic footprint remains strong. So even in places like Africa, where they do actually have a fair amount of popularity, you could see them squeezing them even harder. So I found this a bit unusual. It was a very good opportunity for China to come to position itself, especially against the United States that has struggled to handle the pandemic. But instead, they've decided to become much more aggressive and assertive, even more so than they were before the pandemic.
Okay, time to get quick closing comments from all my panelists now. I've got limited time on the program, so I'm going to ask you to be brief in 30 seconds each. The best way forward, starting first with you, Professor.
I think the international attention needs to be more focused at this point of time, and there should be publicity given for the Hong Kong people's efforts. There was recent moves in terms of the national security law that needs to be dissected much more in looking at what is its impact on Hong Kong people. And the basic law and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region provisions need to be once again brought back into the, and UK, Canada, France, US have been in the forefront recently, but India has been silent so far on the Hong Kong related events. I think we need to also look at this more closely in the near future.
All right, Ambassador.
Frank, what I'd like to say is I think it's a very defining moment as far as China is concerned, as far as China-Hong Kong relations are concerned, but in a much broader way also. You know, even if I were not to say that it is a Tiananmen moment as far as China is concerned, because it is reaching out and it wants to see what the world is going to do. But even if it's not a Tiananmen moment, it's definitely a South China Sea moment. It's like in 2016 when we had the Permanent Court of Arbitration. It came out, China came out with its 9-dash line, and no country said nothing at all about this. I think this is such a moment. I think the world really has to get up in a meaningful way, not in the sort of, message or letter. I think just talking is not enough. I think there has to be something more significant and more substantive. Hong Kong people themselves, of course, can protest, and like they did last year, I'm sure they're going to come out this year also. But it is the international community that has really to come out and stand with them, support them. Otherwise, if China is able to get its way this time, there will be no stopping it. I mentioned Taiwan. There could be many other things in the future.
Okay, all right. And Pramit, a quick closing comment from you.
Well, I think the key point is that China clearly doesn't believe it has to worry about international opinion right now, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of the lack of US leadership, and a sense that they don't really face there's no single country definitely that can take them on. So my sense is that if there has to be a good international response, it has to be coordinated. And we can see that the attempts to play with a Quad plus structure, for example, being put forward by Washington, with hopefully the Europeans will get their act together, though I have my doubts. But other than a coordinated action between at least several big middle power countries,
Right.
Chinese have nothing to worry about until that happens. And that's where the focus has to be.
Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.
Thank you.